food travels out of the stomach, it goes into the small intestine. And it's named the small intestine because it is a long, narrow tube. So it has a narrow diameter, and that's why it's called the small intestine. But in terms of length, it's a very long part of the digestive tract, around about 21 metres long in the adult horse. It comprises 30% of the horse's gastrointestinal volume and has a capacity of around about 60 litres. So because it's this long tube, although it only comprises 30% of the total volume of the gastrointestinal tract, it's actually 75% of its length. And this is basically the tube that joins the stomach to the large intestine. And the small intestine has three parts. The first part is the duodenum. This is the first part after the stomach, and this is where a lot of neutralising and mixing takes place. In this area, bile is secreted from the liver to buffer this pH. So the pH of the ingesta coming out of the stomach and entering the small intestine ranges somewhere from between 2.5 to 3. So we want to get that pH back up to almost neutral or slightly above neutral, 7 to 7.5. And that's facilitated by bile being secreted into this area, and also by bicarbonate secreted from the Brunner's glands into the lumen of the small intestine. The next part is the duodenum, and then the final part of the small intestine is the ileum, and this is the last part before the digesta enters the large intestine. And this is where the majority of nutrients are absorbed in the small intestine. So the majority of nutrients are absorbed in the ileum. I mentioned about the more neutral pH in the small intestine. This is important to facilitate the transport of nutrients across the gut wall and for the optimal activity of the enzymes that are secreted in this area. So the enzymes that are secreted in the small intestine are amylases, lipases, and proteases. And that's because the small intestine is where starch is digested, fats and oils are digested, and proteins are digested. I mentioned the rate of passage in the stomach being around about 30 minutes. Well, the rate of passage in the small intestine is still fairly rapid, somewhere between 45 and 2 hours. It will take the food to move through the small intestine. But that's very much dependent on the diet that the animal's receiving, the type of foodstuff that it's eating, the amount of food it's presented with at one time, so the meal size, and also the amount of forage in the diet. Well, basically, the digestion moves through the gastrointestinal tract by these waves of muscular contractions known as peristalsis, and it moves at approximately 30 centimetres per minute. So I mentioned that starch is digested in the small intestine. Starch is broken down by enzymes called amylases. And these amylases break the starch down into simple sugars. So they break the starch down into glucose. And these simple sugars are absorbed across the small intestinal gut wall and used as an energy source by the animal. Horses can digest starch well, but they actually have a limited amount of starch that they can digest at one time. So if we give them too much starch in one meal, they can only digest a certain amount of that in the small intestine, and the rest will travel through to the large intestinal environment. And this can cause a disturbance to the large intestinal environment. This is not ideal, and we discuss this in more detail when we consider the large intestine itself. But in summary, horses do digest starch well, but they only cope with a limited amount of starch in the small intestine. So what we want to do is make sure that when we do feeds that are high in starch to horses, that we ensure that we don't feed too much at one time. Fats and oils are also digested in the small intestine, and these are digested by enzymes called lipases. And these lipases break the fats and oils down to fatty acids and glycerol. And these are absorbed across the gut wall, and they're also used as an energy source to the horse. Protein digestion takes place in the small intestine. Protein digestion begins in the stomach, where longer chains of proteins are broken down into shorter chains. But these shorter chains are then further broken down in the small intestine by protease enzymes that break them down to produce amino acids. And these amino acids are absorbed across the gut wall in the small intestine and are used by the horse. What we have to remember about proteins is that any proteins that are bound up within the cell wall of the plant, so that's proteins that are associated with the fibrous fraction, and we will come on to discuss that in more detail in further weeks. These proteins are not digested in the small intestine, and instead they travel through to the large intestine, where they're fermented by the microbial populations that reside in the large intestinal environment. And the proteins, therefore, that are broken down in the large intestine, they do not contribute to the amino acid pool of the horse, or at least they're thought not to, but instead they act as a protein source to support microbial growth in the large intestinal environment. I mentioned that the amino acids that go into the large intestinal environment don't contribute to the amino acid pool in the horse. This is the current thinking in this area. However, there is little known about this and further work is required. But the recommendations at the current time are that it is the protein that's digested and absorbed in the small intestine that contributes to the amino acid pool of the horse. And it's also important to mention minerals, because these are also absorbed in the small intestine, or certainly the majority of minerals are absorbed in the small intestinal environment. So in summary then, digestion begins at the mouth. Mastication is important, and therefore it's important to make sure that our horse's teeth are in good order. Saliva production is also important. We have to remember that saliva is produced as a direct result of mastication, so if horses are standing for long periods of time without access to forage, there will be a reduced amount of saliva produced, and this may affect the stomach environment, lowering the pH in the top part of the stomach, which may result in the development of gastric ulcers, so we just need to be mindful of that. Then thinking about the stomach and the small intestine, this is where digestion of fat takes place, of the majority of proteins, and also where we want starch digestion to take place. We see absorption of the simple sugars here, of fatty acids and glycerol, and also of minerals as well. We must remember that horses have a limited capacity for starch digestion in the small intestine, so when we are feeding meals that are high in starch, that we feed them little and often. And then finally, any constituents that are not digested in the small intestine will pass to the large intestine, and we will go on and look at the large intestinal environment in the next video.